All right, welcome everybody. More people are going to be joining us, but thank you so much for being here on this pretty crazy day. I'm Kathy Dervin. I'm with 350 Bay Area Action, where I co-chair our state legislative committee, and just want to really thank you for joining us tonight. In the meantime, as you're joining, please add your name and your 350 group or the city you're from in the chat so we can see everybody who's here. We had a great response, so thank you again for your interest in this topic. Before we get started with the webinar, I just want to say that we don't get a chance for local grassroots 350 climate activists from around the state to get together that often. So I just want to take a moment to say how much it's been a horrible week. We've seen last Wednesday insurrection in the US Capitol in Washington, DC. And I just want to take a moment to send a lot of love and support out to all of you. Grassroots climate activists have kept working through the worst pandemic since 1918, the worst racial injustice protests and events since the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. We've learned how to move all of our organizing onto Zoom when we would much rather be out in the community, meeting people and talking to people and working together, and you just don't give up. So I just have to really applaud you and thank you and send some support and love out to you tonight. Thanks for your constant creativity and commitment. So today, Donald J. Trump was impeached for the second time in a vote of 232 to 197 in the US House of Representatives for inciting an insurrection against our country. Let's take a moment to just note that, but we're still headed into troubled waters. So last Wednesday was the insurrection, today was the impeachment, next Wednesday will be the inauguration of our 46th president, Joe Biden. So please take care of yourself and be careful in the coming weeks, and let's support one another. Tonight's webinar came out of a discussion at the end of the last legislative session in September in the 350 California Legislative Committee, which is a group that meets once a month to share information and resources on state climate legislation. We all make our own decisions about what bills to support, but when we coincide and agree on priorities, we also work together. It's a great group. And at the end of the last legislative session, we discussed how important yet challenging it was to try to analyze and consider housing legislation, how it relates to our climate work, and what housing partners we should be in touch with and learning from. So we decided it would be helpful to have an educational webinar on housing issues for climate activists, which is how this very webinar came about. Then there was the election, and then there was the counting of the votes across the country, and then there was the Georgia election. So we're finally getting to this this session tonight. So again, we really want to thank you for being here on this important topic. We hope to learn more about the housing crisis in California, which has been made only worse by the COVID disaster. So this is a beginning. We know we can't address all the issues around housing in one session. There's transportation, land use, zoning, affordability, equity, displacement with housing, and people that need housing. And but we wanted to just start with this educational session tonight and hopefully give all of us a better overview, understanding of the situation at our local and statewide situation. So let's see. It used to be said when I worked at the state health department that you couldn't solve transportation without housing, and you can't solve climate without transportation. So these issues are integrally linked and complicated and sometimes controversial. So again, we're just delving into this together tonight and really want to thank you for joining us. This webinar is being recorded. I know a number of you have members that couldn't join tonight, but that wanted to have access to it. So we will have a recording and we'll share that out. At the end of the formal presentation and the questions and answers, we will have a short screen of 4 or 5 evaluation questions. It'd be really helpful to get some feedback from what people liked and thought about this and what could be done better and what we could change. So please hang around and fill out the evaluation if you can. So I'm going to turn this over to my co-planner, Michael Roachmace from SoCal 350 Climate Action in Los Angeles, and he's going to introduce the speakers and get us started. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the esteemed panelists that we have here today. So Anya Lawler is a member of the Governor Gavin Newsom's Homelessness Task Force. She's worked on housing policy on behalf of low-income Californians for the Western Center on Law and Poverty, and as a policy consultant for the California State Assembly Housing Committee, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and other organizations in California. Anya is currently a policy advocate for public interest advocates. Jeff Levin is a policy director at East Bay Housing Organizations, an affordable housing advocacy coalition. Jeff previously worked for the City of Oakland for 28 years, including nearly 15 as housing policy and programs manager. He holds 2 master's degrees, including master's degree in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley. At East Bay Housing Organizations, he works on a number of issues, including planning, gentrification and displacement, and state and local housing policies. So thank you both for joining us. They're going to give us a presentation with some background information, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So I have some questions prepared, but anybody who has questions they want to ask as we're doing the presentation, feel free to enter those questions into the chat, and Kathy and I will monitor those questions and try to get them in if we have time at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anya and Jeff. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here tonight. I'm excited to be on a panel with Jeff, who, frankly, I've learned a ton from over the years. So you guys are lucky to have him here too, to share his knowledge. I'm gonna just start with a we all know we don't have enough housing units in California. And that is one of the big pieces of the puzzle. It is not the only piece of the puzzle by far, but it is nonetheless a problem. We should be producing about 180,000 units a year of housing if we want to sort of make up for lost time and get to where we need to be. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've only been hitting about 80,000 on average. So that's bad math right there. Although I will say we're on a bit of an upswing. Permits have increased every year for the last, I think, 3 years running. So I think that's a sign that perhaps some of the interventions that we've been taking to try to stimulate more construction are working. But also, single-family construction in California has drastically outpaced multifamily construction for most of the 20th and 21st centuries. Our housing stock is about 65% single family and only 31% multifamily. So we don't have a diversity of housing types. Although again, good news on that front. The last several years, it's been they've been much closer, although multifamily construction still does not come anywhere close to outpacing single family construction. Another big factor in the affordability crisis is that rental rates have increased far faster than income. So the rent is going up, but people aren't making any more money. California spends 4 times as much money subsidizing homeownership as we do subsidizing affordable rental housing. So that is a huge factor. And, just to add on the homelessness crisis. California has a homelessness crisis unlike any other state in the country. We have about 150,000 plus people experiencing homelessness in California, which is 27% of the total homeless population in the country. We only have 12% of the nation's population, so something is really out of balance there. And while other states have seen steady declines in homelessness, our rate continues to increase, and I'll get a little bit into why. We saw a 16% increase just from 2018 to 2019. So, you know, those are some of this is some of what we're dealing with. And I'm gonna share my screen for a minute because I have a few slides. Where is share screen?
It should be on the bottom, like a green option. You should have the ability.
Oh, there it is. There it is. Sorry, I was just not seeing it. Okay, so I'll go through these pretty quickly, and I might skip over a few because I want to get into meaty stuff. So I bring this slide up just because Jeff and I are probably going to use these terms, and so I want to just start with them. So in the housing world, we divide everybody into income bands that's tied to area median income. So when we talk about somebody who's extremely low income, they're making 30% of their area median income and below. Very low income, moderate income, and then above moderate income. So those are people at 120% AMI and below. And there's been a steady and emerging conversation in the state about perhaps also defining out a deeply low income band at 15% AMI and below. And just because that's a highly underserved income band. And just for some perspective, in San Diego County, the median income for a 3-person household is about $77,650. So that would mean that the upper limit of the moderate income range, which is 120% AMI, is $93,200. San Francisco moderate income band tops out at $147,750. So the income, like the top income range is pretty high in some of these income bands. And so you can imagine, therefore, how many people are in the very low and extremely low income bands, which is just an important thing to know. So we have a huge shortfall of affordable rental homes, almost 1.3 million units short of rental housing affordable to lower income renters. Huge problem. So it's not really a monolithic crisis, right? Not everyone is underserved. It's mostly lower income people. Cost burdened households, people paying 30% or 50% or more of their income in rent. You can see that for extremely low income households, 90% of those households are cost burdened in California. And then you get down into the moderate income band, 43% of them are cost burdened, but only 7% of them are extremely cost burdened. So, you know, disproportionate impacts here, right? Higher income folks are not hurting nearly as much as lower income people. And above moderate income people don't tend to experience a lot of cost burden. Average rent in California, I think this was from 2019, was $1,900 a month. You can see you'd need to make $38 an hour to afford that rent. So that's a huge problem. And then, so in terms of what we're building, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the fifth RHNA cycle, which we'll get into in a little bit, this is the housing element period, and I'll talk about this. We basically cities and counties plan sort of in 8-year chunks for housing. And in the fifth cycle, which we're just coming out of, we have built most of the above moderate, we've built all the above moderate income units we were supposed to have built. But we had shortfalls at all of the other income bands and a severe shortfall at the very low income band. And that adds up partially to a drastic increase in homelessness. Whoops, what happened there? Okay, and so that gets into the funding band. You don't produce lower income housing without subsidy. It just can't be done. And that's not a California issue. That's sort of a national issue. That's, you know, even if we build a ton of market rate housing, we're never going to produce units that are affordable to very low and extremely low income people. It's just not, it's not doable. And funding has plummeted. We've seen a 43% decrease in state and federal funding for affordable housing over the last decade. And that, again, also the same period where we've seen a drastic increase in homelessness. So there's a relationship there. Again, there's the money. Let's see, the loss of redevelopment was a $1 billion hit. That's that money that we were used to getting. Governor Brown axed that, and you can see what happened. It was rough. Now, luckily, the state has invested in the last several years in affordable housing, but not nearly to get us back to where we were, which wasn't even sufficient. And again, keep in mind the thing I said at the beginning, which is we do subsidize quite a bit, primarily through the mortgage interest deduction, which is something like $5 billion a year. Imagine what we could do to bring up those affordable housing numbers if we had $5 billion. So that is kind of the data picture, some of the key statistics, some of the key information that I think are going to be useful as we get into some of the other pieces of the conversation. So I'm going to kick it over to Jeff for that.
Great. Thank you, Anya, and good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here. I want to sort of pick up where Anya left off and talk sort of in larger terms first about how we have typically, and especially more recently, framed some of these issues. A lot of the conversation around housing and the housing crisis has focused specifically on expanding the supply of housing, particularly by making changes in the regulatory environment and building more housing. But for those of us who are working on affordable housing, it's a bit more complicated than that. And we have really come to approach this by saying that the solutions to solving the housing crisis in a really comprehensive way actually rest on what we've now started calling the 3 Ps framework. And those 3 Ps are protection, preservation, and production. And I just want to touch on those for a minute and give you an idea, because it gives you a sense of sort of what the universe of public policy around housing, and especially affordable housing, looks like, which then I think shapes what kinds of things you will see in the way of state and local legislation and other kinds of activism around housing. So let me start with protection, which is specifically tenant protection, and is the issue of protecting tenants from being displaced from their homes. Critical issue, and even more critical right now in the middle of the pandemic, where we have seen rather starkly just how much at risk people are of being displaced, and the consequences of that, both individually for the households who are displaced, but socially as well. Displacing people now means either putting them on the street or having them double up in overcrowded housing with other households, which, in the era of COVID is extremely risky. The big issue around protection that many of us have been focused on since the beginning of the pandemic has been the establishment of moratoria on evictions, making sure that people will not lose their housing, in particular will not lose their rental housing because they are unable to pay rent due to no circumstances of their own choosing. We've seen sort of a massive unemployment and underemployment of people in a hurry, and people unable to pay the rent that was somewhat cushioned initially by the stimulus checks and the extended unemployment benefits, but those have expired, and what's come behind them isn't nearly adequate. And so both at the local level and at the state level, and even federally, there have been a number of measures adopted aimed at essentially establishing a moratorium on evictions. And I want to be clear, these prohibit landlords from evicting tenants for non-payment of rent, especially if that non-payment is in some way related to COVID, if people are home ill, if they've had to care for family members, or if they directly lost their jobs. It doesn't actually eliminate the obligation to pay that rent. What it does is say that landlords can't evict people because they haven't paid the rent. Depending on where these measures have been, sometimes it's simply pushed off until some point in the future, which has people extremely concerned that at some point those moratoria will be lifted and people will suddenly owe a great deal of back rent that they won't be able to pay, and that there could be a wave of evictions. So what people have really fought for and won in many places is not only an eviction moratorium, but a prohibition on ever evicting people for non-payment of rent during the emergency. The debt still exists. It gets converted into standard consumer debt. Landlords would be able to take tenants to court to collect that and collect it like other consumer debt. The key point is that people would not be at risk of actually losing their housing because of the pandemic in particular. And that has taken up a great deal of our time. We passed something at the state level that actually is going to expire pretty shortly, and a lot of work is going on right now on bills to extend that moratorium further. I think Anya will probably talk a bit more about that later this evening. Outside of the immediate pandemic, the kinds of measures that we have looked at for tenant protection are really not surprising. The two big ones are rent control or rent stabilization, so that when people move into housing and have an established rent, they are assured that the rent isn't going to go up drastically. There were a number of cities that had local rent control measures, and then more recently, a sort of mild form of rent control was passed at the state level. Local rent control measures have typically limited rent increases on tenants to somewhere between 2/3 of the inflation rate and the inflation rate itself. So somewhere between 2/3 and 100% of the increase in the consumer price index. The state measure, however, limits rent increases to the consumer price index plus 5%, which is substantially higher than what most local rent control ordinances have allowed, and essentially still allows rents to rise much faster than most tenants' incomes are increasing. So while we've been thankful that we got something that at least prohibited the most egregious rent increases, the state law is not really a full protection for tenants, and people are very much at risk. Rent control needs to be coupled with something called just cause for eviction, which says that you cannot be evicted for no reason. Under state law, tenants can actually be evicted. If they're on a month-to-month lease, they can be evicted with 30 or 60 days notice. If they're on a lease, they can be evicted at the end of the lease. And landlords are not required to give any reason at all. They can just decide they want you out. They don't have to provide a specific reason like non-payment of rent or destroying the premises or something like that. And so for many years, people have focused on passing just cause protections. And the linkage between that and rent control is if you have just cause and say you can't be evicted for no reason, only for non-payment, then one way that landlords get tenants out is to just jack their rents up beyond their ability to pay. And, now you have a just cause, which is the tenant was unable to pay the rent. On the flip side, if you have rent control, but not just cause, the landlord can't increase the rent, but they could simply evict you for no cause and you're out. And because of an important limitation in state law known as the Costa-Hawkins Act, when a unit is vacated, landlords are allowed to reset the rent at market rent. And so you can see there's tremendous incentives for landlords to find ways to get long-term tenants out of their buildings if there is rent control, because once the tenants leave, they're able to increase the rents substantially. So whenever we are working on these measures, we're always looking for a combination of both rent control or rent stabilization and just cause for eviction. And I think those are sort of the two primary protection measures. We've also looked at things like ordinances that are called right to return, so that where people have been displaced in the past, in the last couple of years, people were displaced. again, through no fault evictions, through gentrification and displacement, that as new housing is developed in an area, that people who had been displaced from the neighborhood would have priority to return. That's especially something we've looked at for affordable housing, so that if new affordable housing goes into a neighborhood, the people who had been pushed out before that housing came would have first shot at coming back in. And I will say the issue of protection is both about protecting individual tenants from being displaced from individual units, and also about protecting communities from being displaced from entire neighborhoods, and making sure that we can preserve a mix of income levels in a neighborhood over time. The second P that we focus on is preservation of existing housing. We divide that into two parts. The first has to do with preserving existing assisted housing that is under some kind of long-term regulatory restriction or subsidy contract. And many of those units will expire at some point. That's less of a problem where we have community-based nonprofits that are operating the housing, because they have no incentive to convert that to market rate. They're likely to extend the restrictions. But we have seen over the years, and this problem now goes back a good 30 years, that as contracts for rental assistance and for development subsidies expire, owners decide not to renew them and to opt out of those contracts, convert the housing to market rate. And we end up losing substantial public investment in a really scarce resource of affordable housing. And so over the years, we've developed a number of both regulatory and financing approaches to making sure that the existing limited supply of affordable housing isn't further reduced. More recently, we've come to focus on a different issue, which is preservation of what has been called naturally occurring affordable housing. And by this, we mean housing that is not under any kind of restriction or regulation, just market rate housing that at the moment happens to be affordable to people at lower incomes, but there is no guarantee over the long term that that housing will remain affordable, or even will remain as rental housing at all. So the first piece in that really has to do with just preserving rental housing from being lost through demolition or through conversion to condominiums, or seeing single room occupancy residential hotels converted to other uses. All of these, they have displacement effects, and that's the protection piece, but we're also concerned with not losing this housing stock. What's been of particular importance, and we've seen a lot more interest in this in the last several years, has been efforts to acquire existing housing that is currently affordable and have it be acquired by community land trusts or by nonprofits or by tenant cooperatives in ways that will preserve that housing as permanently affordable. So the housing might be affordable now, but it is at risk of going to market rate over time. And through a combination of regulatory and financing programs, we have been looking at ways to get control of that housing, take it out of the speculative market, and preserve it long-term as affordable housing. And we can certainly talk more about this in the Q&A portion if people are more interested in specific approaches on that. And then the third P is production. And of course, we've seen lots and lots of discussion about the need to develop new housing. Anya mentioned that we aren't anywhere close statewide to meeting our need for production of housing just to keep up with the growth in population, the growth in households. We have economic growth as well as demographic growth. As she said, we need to be producing somewhere around 180,000 units a year statewide, and we're not really even doing half that much, and we've been falling short, particularly in the area of multifamily housing, which is really where rental housing for low-income people is going to be. So there's been a lot of focus just on increasing production. The theory being, if we expand the supply, more supply should mean that prices come down. Many of us in the affordable housing movement we are supportive of expanding the supply, but we don't really see that as having a significant impact on reducing housing costs for people who are already severely cost burdened. What we do see is that if we don't continue to produce new housing, even market rate, there will be more upward pressure on rents, and we want to stop that. But as Anya mentioned earlier, we don't think that just producing more market rate housing at the high end of the market is ever going to filter down enough to lower rent units. People who are currently paying more than 50% of their income for rent need rent reductions of about 50% in order to actually be paying what's considered an affordable rent. And there's just no way that we are going to see an expansion of market rate housing that would cause rents at the bottom of the market to fall by 50%. Quite frankly, if we start to see rents falling as the result of new production, it's a self-limiting process. Developers stop investing and building new housing when they see the market going down. They invest when the market is going up. And so we are focused not just on producing new housing and removing regulatory restrictions, but also on specifically incentivizing and financing affordable housing. And we'll talk more about what that looks like in concrete terms, but I will say on the regulatory side, this has to do with issues around land use planning and zoning and permitting and making sure that all communities are zoning to provide not just high-end single-family housing, but also zoning for multifamily housing, that we can streamline the permitting processes, and that we provide both incentives and, as I said, most importantly, financing to provide the gap between what it costs to build housing and what people can afford. So that 3 Ps framework has really been shaping the legislative agenda for housing for the last several years. And with that, I'm going to bounce it back to Anya and let her talk a bit about state housing law.
I'm already realizing that Jeff and I probably scoped out way too robust of an agenda. And so I'm going to give a pretty high level overview because I know people have a lot of questions and we have a couple other topics to cover. So, you know, there are, I don't know, it's hard to know where to start. I think I'm going to go over a couple of key laws that are, I think, crucial sort of in understanding. Jeff actually talked about the really important tenant protection laws, and so I don't even have to go into those. But I do want to go back to housing element law because so many of the conversations in the Capitol kind of flow from what is known as the regional housing needs allocation process and the housing element process. So local governments have general plans. Most of you, I bet, are aware. Every city and county in the state has a general plan that is it's the constitution for development in that community. And there's various elements that have to be covered in a general plan: land use, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the housing element. And the housing element is the only piece of the general plan that has a mandatory update schedule. Under state law, cities and counties, most cities and counties in the state have to update every 8 years. It used to be every 5 years. It shifted a few years back, and some small rural places are still on a 5-year cycle, but most are 8 years. And so, you know, what happens is what tees off this whole process is the state Department of Housing working with the demographers and the data crunchers at the Department of Finance projects how many housing units a region will need over the next 8 years. And so say we're talking about, I'm in Sacramento, so I'm going to talk about the SACOG region, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments region, which is a 6-county region. Those of you in the Bay Area have the ABAG region. In LA, you have SCAG, et cetera. So the state gives a number to the region and they say, you have to plan for this number of housing units at 4 income levels: very low income, moderate income, above moderate income. They hand that number to the COG, so SACOG, and using, you know, a process and following priorities outlined in statute, the COG has to divvy that up and assign a number to every jurisdiction. And every jurisdiction has to be allocated a share of the obligation at the lower income levels. You don't have to give anyone a share at the above moderate income levels, but everyone always gets kind of a share of each. And what that then tees up is that the city and county then undergoes a process of developing their housing element. And housing element is a pretty weedy document that has to cover a whole lot of things. It's an opportunity for the community to analyze housing needs, to look at who is served and who is not served in the community, to really look at populations who may have special needs, people with disabilities, et cetera, and look at where the gaps are, analyze their own local programs and processes to see if they're putting up barriers to serving the housing needs of everybody in the community. It's a whole process. And then what they also have to do in that process is they have to be able to show that the city has, or the county has, enough land zoned residential, or that allows for residential development, where that amount of housing can be built. So say the city of Sacramento got assigned 100,000 units over the next 8 years. I have no idea what their number is. And maybe a quarter at each income level. They've got to show that they have zoned capacity for 100,000 units of housing. And for housing at the lower income level, they have to have multifamily sites. And Jeff hit on this before. You're not going to get housing affordable to lower income households on single family sites. Affordable housing developers build multifamily housing because that's how we stretch subsidy and build at a lower cost, or at least get more out of our subsidy dollars. So they have to do that. And it's not just a paper exercise. They actually have to zone. They have to make the land available. And there's a whole bunch of other complexities to the process. If they don't do the zoning on time, there are things that happen. Those sites then have to allow development by right, which means ministerially at the staff level, they don't end up going through the CEQA process, because CEQA only applies to discretionary projects, meaning projects that get reviewed by a governing body, not approved at the staff level. And anyway, so there are some checks and balances in there to make sure that things get done. So and that's been around for a long time. And you might say, well, that sounds pretty great. Why then are we so woefully underbuilding housing? And why do we still have so much single family zoned capacity and so little multifamily zoned capacity? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that we could go into, and I'm sure we'll get to some of that in the Q&A. But I will say that, one challenge with all of that is, again, there is no production obligation, but what the community's obligation is to make zoned capacity available and also strip away barriers that they're putting up to housing development. And over the years, there's been a lot of enforcement challenges too. And so it's been really, really hard to get really robust housing elements and to really get the enforcement of the laws that we already have on the books. And that, fortunately, has changed quite a bit in the last few years. And we're seeing a lot more attention on that process, which is resulting in, better housing elements and more attention to the sorts of obligations that cities and counties actually have and are being held accountable to. So I think that's a good upward trend. And we have other laws that are designed to help as well. We have density bonus law, which basically says if you, developer, are building a multifamily project and you would like to build more densely, if you agree to include affordable units in your project, you're going to get a density boost. You're going to be able to build more density, which is going to enable you to include more market rate units. And that's going to enable you to cover the financing gap on the affordable units. So that's a tool that sort of a win-win. Developer gets to build more, we get more density, we get affordable units out of the deal. We have a law called the Housing Accountability Act, which for years was officially statutorily known as the anti-NIMBY law. For some reason, we changed that in statute, but we all still call it the anti-NIMBY law, which requires cities and counties to approve housing that is proposed on sites that are zoned for housing. That's a good tool. It has its limits though, because often developers are really loath to trigger that law because they don't want to sue the city that they're trying to build in. They want to try to figure out a path, want to get their project built so they can, if you're a market rate person, so you can make the money, or if you're an affordable developer, so you can deliver the product that the community needs. We've tried to strengthen that over the years and also give other people standing to bring claims under the Housing Accountability Act. So it doesn't have to be the developer. It can be an organization representing low-income people who aren't going to get the housing they needed, trying to bring more pressure and enforcement under that law. And there's a whole host of other stuff too, but the key is enforcement, and really holding cities and counties accountable to faithfully executing their obligations under the law, which is a huge challenge. That's probably enough of that. I think some other stuff on those topics will come up during the Q&A. Do you want to talk, Jeff, a little bit about sort of the integration with land use, SCS process, all of that?
Yeah. Thanks. And actually, I noticed there was a question in the chat a few minutes ago about when do we get to climate, and the answer is now. I want to talk specifically about provisions in state law that are aimed at land use planning and housing and transportation and how those interact with our efforts on climate change. So I think all of you are probably familiar with AB 32, California's sort of signature piece of climate legislation. A couple of years after AB 32 was adopted, the state adopted a second piece of legislation, SB 375, which was designed to deal with climate change through the processes of land use and transportation, and to integrate land use planning, transportation planning, and housing planning at the regional level. And the most important part about SB 375 is that it requires each region on a regular basis to adopt what's known as a sustainable communities strategy, which brings together the regional transportation plan with land use planning and housing, specifically to come up with development patterns and development strategies that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions primarily by reducing vehicle miles traveled. In other words, reducing the long commutes that people have from suburban sprawl into job centers by building, coming up with regional plans that will encourage both the housing and the transportation in ways that put housing either close to transit or close to job centers, even if those job centers are not directly served by transit. So every region gets a target for climate reduction from the Air Resources Board, and then has to develop this SCS and demonstrate that the plan's actually going to achieve those greenhouse gas reduction targets. And that's a regional planning process that happens every 4 years. The time horizon on the sustainable community strategy is 30 years. Here in the Bay Area, we're just in the process of adopting Plan Bay Area 2050. So the draft of that plan's about to go out. And there's a direct integration with this with housing planning that has to do with the RHNA, which Anya mentioned, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, which is part of SB 375. First of all, put the RHNA planning cycle on the same, put it in sync with the SCS. So the SCS is done every 4 years. Housing elements are done every 8 years. So every other FCS, there also has to be an updated regional housing needs allocation. And there is a requirement that the distribution of housing in the RHNA be consistent with the planning and growth framework that is in the sustainable community strategy, because otherwise the fear is you get a transportation plan that says we're going to do development sort of with this footprint, and then we get a set of housing allocations that might not mesh with that at all. And one of the key points of SB 375 was to say we want land use and transportation planning and housing to all be aligned and looking at the same prospective footprint for growth over the long term, which has been pretty critical and has changed to some extent how people are doing their RHNAs. Once the RHNA is done, as Anya said, cities then have to go out and do their housing elements. But I also want to note the RHNA is driven by more than just climate issues. And one of the things that has come to the fore, it's always been a driving component of RHNA and housing development law, has been the idea that every city and a region needs to do their fair share to address the region's housing needs. But what has happened in the last couple of years much more explicitly is to put racial and economic equity and specifically the notion of affirmatively furthering fair housing into housing element law in a very direct and mandatory way, so that one of the goals that has to be met through the RHNA and through housing element is that at the regional level and the local level, housing planning actually helps to break down barriers of segregation and exclusion. So in general, what comes out of the SCS is a focus on a lot of transit-oriented development and building much denser housing close to transit, particularly along rail lines and places where multiple bus